Hi, this is Simon from Tokyo Productions and welcome to another tutorial for Blackmagic Fusion. And today we're going to take a quick look at a better method for creating depth blur than the built-in depth blur tool. So here is my raw render without any depth blur in it at all. And here is a version with the Fusion depth blur filter applied. And this is a version with my improved depth blur. Now, one of the main differences between these options is if we look at the Fusion depth blur, what's happened at the back here is that these bright lights have dimmed down to a mid-grey, and that's because of the nature of the blur that's being applied. Whereas if we look at my version, you'll see these lights are not only bright, they're super bright, and that's what happens with real depth blur. You'll also see that they've got a little five-sided shape, and you'll probably notice also that these highlights at the back here have all got the five-sided lens shape as well. So it's a much more photorealistic look. So to make this trick work, what we need to do is take our rendered scene. We need to make sure that our renderer is outputting, obviously, the Z channel, the depth channel. So what we need to do, and it's what I'm doing here with the custom tool, is I'm remapping the Z depth. So let's have a look at the Z depth there. There we go, that's the Z depth view normalized by clicking the normalize button there. And if we switch to my custom view, we can see that I've taken that and I've mapped that to the RGB. Now, the thing to know about Z, of course, is if we look down here, right down here, if you look at the values down there for Z, the value here is -4. The value right there at the background is -34. And those values are no good for the purposes of what we want to do. We want to remap -4 and -34 to 0 and 1. So we're going to do that with a custom tool. And let me start that from scratch. Let's add a custom tool and let's pipe the output of the renderer into it. You'll notice I've added a blur, 2-pixel blur to the render. That's just to smooth down some of the aliasing. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is I'm going to come to the config tab here, open up the number controls, and I'm going to rename N1 as near and N2 as far. So when we come back to our controls, we can see that those first top two sliders have been given those names. Okay, now we're going to come over to the Enter tab, and we're going to enter this expression here for the intermediate one. I'm not going to go into too much detail about how that works, but essentially N1 and N2, you remember, are our two sliders, our near and far sliders. Z1 obviously is the input Z depth channel. So this is remapping those values to 0 and 1. What I'm also going to take is this expression here, paste that into intermediate 2, and what that's doing is it's taking the result of intermediate 1 and just clamping it to the 0 to 1 range, because we don't want out of range values. So then what we need to do is we need to take the I2 value, come to our channels, and we just want to enter that into red, green, and blue. So I2 for each of those, and let's have 1 for the alpha, because we just want that to be solid. So currently we can't see anything. We just need to have a check on those Z depth values. So our foreground here is about -4.6. and our background there is at -34. So we're just going to come over to custom. So I can't remember again what it is, -4.6 for near and -34 for far. And you can see now we've got a grayscale map for our Z depth. And this is, we're looking at the RGB here. And you'll notice that now I can adjust my far slider and I can determine how far back my Z effect is going to go, and similarly with the near. So now what we can do is use this output to drive any number of different depth effects. Now you'll notice that what I've done in this instance, here's my render. Before I've even looked at the whole issue of blur, I've used my depth map to adjust the color. So first of all, I've added a color curves there. And what I'm doing, as you can see there, is I'm pushing up the blues, and I'm using the depth map to limit that to the far distance. You'll notice that I've chosen luminance for the channel. That could equally well be red. Because we've mapped it to the RGB, luminance is fine. And what I've also done is I've inverted the mask. I just find it a little bit easier to read a Z depth channel if my foreground is white and my background is black, but obviously we actually want to apply it the other way. So that's why I'm inverting it there. So what I did there, you can see that if I bypass this curves here, you can see how it's adding that nice blue wash to the background and making it recede even more. And then I added another curves where I reduced the blue. So we have a look at that. Again, using that same map to limit it, but inverting the mask so we're only now affecting the foreground. So we're adding warmth, or rather taking out blue out of the foreground. So we started with that, pretty boring, and we ended up with that. And as you know, cooler colours appear to recede into the distance and warmer colours appear to push forward into the foreground. So adjusting the relative grade through the Z depth is a really nice thing to be able to do. I've exaggerated there for the purposes of this demonstration, of course. So then what I'm doing is I'm using that to drive my blur, and that's what we get here. Now, the reason this looks so nice is I'm not using a standard blur, I'm using the defocus tool. So add tool, blur, defocus. It's this one here. And you'll notice it's got all sorts of additional controls. It's not just a straight Gaussian blur, which we could select. It's a lens blur as well. So if we take our original scene and have a look at that just straight through there, and then increase the defocus size, you can see how it creates these little n-gons, because that's what we've got selected. We can adjust these various different parameters to get the lens effect we want. And what it's doing is, instead of dimming down the highlights, it's actually punching them up, and that's because of the bloom factor here. You'll see that if I reduce the bloom right down, it doesn't do that, but we can really punch up those whites, and that's a really nice photorealistic effect. But obviously we want that to be affected by the Z depth, so our foreground is in focus. So we can take the output of our Z depth map, and if we come over here, select luminance, and then apply mask inverted, you'll see how we've achieved that. And our foreground's in focus, and our background is starting to have that lens blur look. And there's a lot we can do to adjust that. We can increase the number of sides of our lens. We can adjust the shape. I quite like this. So if we do increase that, it becomes a little bit more star-like. And obviously, conversely, as we go towards 0, it makes it rounder. So quite a few options really with this whole thing. We can adjust the lens angle. It's a pretty nice filter. So I hope you've been able to see how useful this remapping technique is. Obviously, we can use our nice defocus filter there, but as you've seen, we can use it to grade the foreground and the background separately. We could also, for example, use it to add more grain as we recede into the distance, something one often wants to be able to do. And we can very easily control it using these near and far controls that we set up. So for example, I could enter a near value of -8 and the plane in focus is going to recede. Let's go for -12 and it'll come even further back. So we've actually built a very useful little tool. So there you go. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again another time.